All right, good morning, everyone. Afternoon, if anyone's on the East Coast. Welcome to the webinar. Today's topic is the cultural diversity of grief and loss. We're very excited and thank you so much for joining us today. These complimentary webinars are brought to you through a collaboration of sponsorship with O'Connor Mortuary, Care Choices Hospice and Palliative Services, Caring Companions at Home, and Chatterton and Associates, the wealth management team, as well as us here at Alzheimer's Orange County. My name is Melissa Klabe, and I'm the Director of Education here at Alzheimer's Orange County, and I'm thrilled to be your host today. Our sponsors are providing these webinars to you as a service to the community on topics that are beneficial for anyone who cares for and works with older adults. And so we hope you find today's presentation informative and useful. And today our presenter is going to be Dr. Bill Hoy. So today's presenter is Dr. William Hoy, D-Min, FT. He's a clinical professor at Baylor University with 35 years of experience in caring for the dying and the bereaved. Before coming to Baylor, he directed pastoral care and bereavement programs at 2 hospices and served as a pastor. Dr. Hoy is passionate about making sure the dying and bereaved are treated with compassion and understanding and is widely regarded as an authority on the subject. Dr. Hoy holds an undergraduate degrees in the social sciences and graduate training in practical theology and counseling. His books include Do Funerals Matter? The Purposes and Practices of Death Rituals in Global Perspective, Guiding People Through Grief, Bereavement Groups and the Role of Social Support, and Road to Emmaus. He has also authored more than 100 book chapters, educational pamphlets, and journal articles over the last 35 years, and he's graciously given us his contact information. So as I mentioned, if you have questions, please do type them in, but if we don't get to all of them, feel free to reach out to him by email. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hoy.
Well, thank you guys so much. It is a delight and an honor, and I feel a distinct privilege to get to spend a little time with all of you today, whether it's morning or afternoon like it is where I live. The slide that is in front of you now, I trust, reminds me to remind you that all of us come from a cultural background. While it is true that I practiced and lived for 25 years in Southern California, I am now an adopted Texan, and I grew up in Louisiana. And that influences how I think in lots of different ways. And I dare say it influences how all of us think. The place where we grew up, the family system in which we were a part, the cultural milieu, whether that's the food or the social mores or the religious faith or the people who were around us. And so one of the things that I find really helpful in developing cultural competence is to take some time periodically simply to reflect on where I've been and the cultural context in which I live now and the cultural context in which I have lived. If you're thinking about this with people, with others in the room, I'm going to give you 25 seconds to talk with each other about what your definition of cultural competence is. And if you're by yourself, you might just jot your definition of cultural competence, what you include in your notes. And in 25 seconds, I'm going to start talking again. So I would bet that if you made a list or if you talked about it with the other people with whom you might be viewing this webinar, that you talked about things like valuing diversity or understanding others, communicating effectively with people who are different from me, being conscious of the dynamics that are inherent when cultures intersect. Maybe you thought about having capacity to understand how others think or act or behave. Maybe you thought about things in terms of your own ability to respond. How do I actually understand cultural competence? There are no single definitions of cultural competence. It's one of the things that makes study and literature in our field so difficult, is because cultural competence is defined differently by virtually everybody writing in that arena. But one thing that has become clear to me over my career, working, of course, I practiced all of my career in Long Beach, California. And for those of you that don't know Long Beach well, at least during the 1990s and early 2000s when I was there, Long Beach was the Long Beach Unified School District claimed to have more than 110 languages spoken at home in the families of its students. And that gives some idea of the microcosm of the world that is Southern California. And I know the vast majority of you live in Southern California. But if we're going to be culturally competent, it seems that two things are paramount. One, I have to understand what activities or practices are within my purview, and also what values are in my purview. And in the time we spend together this afternoon, I plan to kind of unpack some of those issues. The first of those has to do with this basic value business. We think a lot in cross-cultural affairs about social worldviews. If you live and practice work in healthcare, as I have virtually all of my professional career, then you're undoubtedly familiar with our laws of informed consent, the bioethical principles of patient autonomy, and things such as that. But what's important to understand, I believe, is that those particular notations, those laws, those ethical premises are all founded upon a basic Western way of seeing the world. It is a worldview that says the individual is paramount or most important, that my values originate in me as an individual person, and it stresses such things as individual initiative or action or interests. That works pretty well for those of us who are white, middle class, Western, English-speaking individuals. It does not always work so well for people who come from a part of the world where collectivism is the shared value and the most important marker of culture. In those communities, unlike the ones in which I grew up, and I dare say many of our participants today grew up, in those communities, it is the collective that is paramount. It is the group that is most valuable. And the values originate not in the individual person and in determining what is in it for me or what's best for me, but rather values originate in the community itself. And values are actually derived by consensus rather than by people saying. In a collective worldview, for example, you will rarely ever hear somebody say, well, it's okay for you. It may be okay for you, but it's not okay for me, or vice versa. You would almost never hear that kind of communication. In fact, hearing that you're okay, my okay, I'm okay sort of approach is almost a guarantee that the person you're talking with is an individual who sees the world through an individualist lens. Collectives tend to stress the group solidarity over individual desires. It's not about what I want, it is about what is best for us all. I saw this, or I heard of this pretty clearly some years ago after that horrific shooting at Virginia Tech University, which happened to have been perpetrated by a young man, a student who was of Korean American descent. And a colleague of mine from Southern California was traveling in South Korea not too many months after that event. And he said he began to notice almost immediately upon his arrival that people would come up to him randomly on the street and would bow respectfully and would apologize. And he didn't understand what that was about. And he said it went on for several days and happened multiple different places and times. And finally, he asked his host if he could explain. And his host explained that people identified him because he was tall and blonde and dressed like an American, that he was an American. And so they were, as best they knew how, he said, as it was explained to him, they were expressing the collective sorrow of an entire culture, even though the behavior for which they were apologizing was the behavior of the one. And I think that illustrates particularly well one of the challenges that we face in American healthcare today is that those of us who were classically trained in bioethical principles, bioethical decision making, informed consent, HIPAA laws, and all manner of things such as that, we are always living in two worlds when we are working with people who are from other parts of the globe who may not share our individualistic worldview. And that's not to say that we need to set the legal standard aside that we depend on by California law or by federal law, but it does mean that simply we need to make sure that we are honoring the fact that in many of these communities, families, and cultural groups, it is the we who is more important than the me. So, what does that mean for those of us who practice? Well, I think the main thing that it means is that we ask questions. One of the things I have found particularly helpful is rather than assuming that patients will be making all decisions by themselves, I found it particularly useful to say, tell me about the people who will be weighing in on the choices you make. Who'll have a vote? Who'll be giving you advice? Who'll be offering their perspective? What I'm saying is that cultural competence means that we honor the fact that not everybody understands or nearly appreciates the whole notion of informed consent and patient autonomy, like perhaps you and I do. Second piece, I think, is to remember that family culture is driven by its own sense of family structure and inclusion. Who's in, who's out, who counts, who doesn't, who's part of the family, who is not. Surely those of you practicing in Southern California have been present, and certainly if you've been at any point in your career have practiced in a hospital setting, have had the experience of explaining very patiently to a surgery or trauma patient's family that visiting hours in the intensive care unit are for immediate family only to turn around an hour later and find 77 immediate family members in the waiting room. Part of that is understanding what family means. For most non-dominant cultural groups in the United States, in other words, people who are not of Northwestern European descent, for most people other than we white folk, it is fairly common that family is much larger. The suburban family idea of we four no more is foreign to many folks that with whom we work. And so again, asking who's involved is incredibly important. I was working with a family while I was practicing in Long Beach. I was in the hospital at the time, and the family really, I think, knew that the patient's condition had deteriorated and that the artificial ventilated support that we were using was of no avail. I think they knew that at least on one level, but they seemed powerless to be willing for us to disconnect the respirator. And this went on for quite a number of hours, maybe into the second day, I don't exactly remember, until the family's pastor arrived. And I briefed him very quickly on what had taken place. He went in, he spent maybe 6 minutes with the family. And when he emerged, he said, "They're ready." And the physician went back into the intensive care room, and the family said, "We've talked with Pastor, called his name, and we think it's okay now." And it caused me to think that now this particular family was African American, and so was their pastor, but this could have been repeated in any number of other settings. And what I learned as a very young caregiver at that point was that frequently the people who have significant say in decision making may not be the people that we include in our assumption about who the family is. My colleague and friend Ken Doka began 30 years ago, perhaps, saying that instead of talking about family, we would be wise to talk about the circle of care. Who are the people who are there? Who is the support system? Who are the folks that are part of the in group or the out group? We've all had experiences with families where perhaps the people who were the immediate next of kin were not the trusted advisors to the patient. And I think we have to always be careful to understand. And again, asking questions is the key. You'll notice that every time you see the word "so" on the screen, it's probably going to be accompanied with my advice that we make fewer statements and that we ask more questions. Can you help me understand? Who are the people who are in your camp? Or who are the people who are in your court? Or who are the people who are there for you? Who are your most trusted advisors? What are the steps that you feel like you're going to want to take in order to make a decision about this particular thing? The third principle for understanding culture, becoming more culturally competent, I believe, is that we understand differing resources for healing. I teach medical students. After a car wreck that I was in 2.5 years ago, I have seen umpteen medical specialists dealing with urologists to deal with pelvic pain issues, neurologists to deal with the head injury, orthopedists to deal with the hip injury, and all manner of allied therapists in all of those disciplines who have helped me with various and sundry parts of that recovery process. My tendency when faced with any kind of health crisis is to reach out to my colleagues in medicine. They are the people I know best. They are the ones whose methods I understand best. They are the people that I broker in the kinds of things that they do because we have collaborated together on so many patients throughout our careers. I know most of them by first name. We are not only colleagues, we are friends. I depend on a scientific view to approach medicine, but not everybody in our world does. People also look for traditional or alternative or complementary healing methods as well. And finally, people also expect to look toward spiritual healing methods. I realize that even though I am a thoroughgoing scientist in the way I approach healthcare, that I am not opposed to using other methods. I pray regularly and worship. Study reading of the scripture is important for me, and I often derive significant healing resources from that arena. In the days and weeks after the crash that I was in February of 2017, I realized that there was very little that brought solace quite like spending time reading what in Judeo-Christian circles we call the Psalms of Lament. But I also have depended in large measure on traditional or alternative or so-called complementary healing techniques. In fact, just this afternoon, an hour after I finish this webinar, I have an appointment with my acupuncturist because he actually has found ways, solutions to dealing with some of the chronic pain that occurred as a result of that crash that no other practitioner has yet found. And so I guess what I'm saying is that all of these resources are helpful for us in various and sundry ways. Most of us have a preferred way of doing things. The way that I say it is what's your first choice? Now, you may employ all of them eventually, but what's your first choice? And my first choice, if I'm having chest pain, after I start to think through what might this be, do I have other symptoms of a cardiac problem or not? My default mechanism is to go to the ED, to head to the hospital. That's what my default mechanism is. I very well may pray on the way, and I will not send the chaplain out of the room if she or he shows up. But that won't be my first default, and I am a man of profound faith. My default is to go toward the science. And many Western healthcare practitioners, that is our default. It is probably less so for those of those of us who broker on the behavioral science or the social science side of the aisle. But the important thing to remember is that for physicians and nurses, often they assume that patients start first with the scientific approach. So if a physician prescribes a medication, this patient will surely take it. And of course, all of us who have worked with patients, and I don't even like what we call them, but we do call them non-compliant patients. Any of us who have worked with non-compliant patients know that just because a scientific practitioner following the best evidence-based practices in the world prescribes a particular treatment does not mean that this patient is going to take it. And that's not always just because one speaks a different language or comes from a different ethno-linguistic people group. Sometimes that's because of an issue that I'm going to talk about just a little bit later. So what do we do? Well, I think one of the powerful things that I teach my medical students to do is to ask patients, so, Mrs. Smith, as you know, I'm going to probably prescribe a medication for you, but I'm curious. I wonder what the other ways are that you have found healing from illnesses in the past. What are the other sources you tend to go to? And if Mrs. Jones doesn't quite follow what I'm asking, then I prompt her a little bit and say, well, you know, some people find that praying or reading the Bible or going to an acupuncturist or getting a massage or taking or some deep breathing or relaxation techniques can be very powerful. I'm just curious, which ones have you found helpful in illnesses in the past? And if a physician or a other practitioner does that with an open hand, without in some way by our tone of voice shading which one we think is valid and which we think are invalid, I think we'll get honest responses from people that in fact they depend on several diverse modes of healing. Well, how about quality of life? It's a term we throw around in American society and especially in American healthcare all the time. In fact, much of the debate that has encircled the whole notion of physician assistance in hastening death has come down to this element of quality of life. That it doesn't matter how long you live, it's what the quality of that life is. What I have found is that it's a hugely important thing for me to stop periodically and to ask myself, what does quality of life mean for me? And one of the things that I've found with both students and colleagues when I've been speaking to people in front of live groups is that when folks begin to share what quality of life means or what kinds of things make life worth living, they are frequently frequently couched in the notion of what abilities I have, or what abilities I can maintain, or what abilities, if I once lose them, no longer makes life worth living. And I strongly urge us as professionals and volunteers who might be watching this webinar to think seriously about that. What are the abilities that I have to have in order for my life to be worth living? And be very careful which ones you list, because it may very well be that you are inadvertently superimposing those values on those you care for. And that somehow, if a person is no longer able to be verbally communicative, because that's a high value for me, that I may see the other's life as less worth preserving or less worth living. And most of the time, I find that we are repulsed by that notion that we might actually think another's life is of less value or of less worth. But we are very close to that notion when we begin to set up a set of abilities and say life is not worth living if I can't do this thing, that thing, and this other thing. Because the fifth principle is that we come to terms with exactly how those with whom we work measure trust in the healthcare system. Over the years, it has occurred to me that people trust or mistrust us for various and sundry reasons. As behavioral health professionals, those of us who broker in that part of the healthcare interchange talk a lot about building rapport. When I'm teaching young physicians to be, we talk a lot about the patient-physician relationship and how that is impacted by the patient's experience with illness. And all of those things are different ways of saying the same thing, and that is that we have differing levels of trust in the system that we are charged with. Now, from what I told you earlier in the webinar about my own default position to reach out to scientific medical providers, you probably would conclude, and you would do so correctly, that I have a great deal of trust in the healthcare system. Now, admittedly, the healthcare system as we know it is deeply flawed in the way it delivers health care, and the way that it is not anywhere close to being equitable in the way that it delivers resources. All of those things are true about the system. Fortunately for me, I've spent enough time teaching in Europe and practicing in Africa that on the whole, I'm pretty delighted by the kind of healthcare that I'm able to access living in the United States. At the same time, not everybody has had that experience. And part of the reason that I've had that experience is because I'm a white man of privilege, one who has, by birth lottery or whatever you want to call it, been blessed to have pretty high levels of resources available to me most of my life. Now, I do have to also say that there were an awful lot of years when Debbie and I drove really old cars because we didn't have enough money to buy health insurance and pay a car note. But on the whole, an awful lot of my access to good health care has been in part conditioned by the fact that I have had the abilities to earn a living and to make a living to purchase healthcare insurance, which then gave me pretty good access most of the time, even if I paid a large portion of our income in any given year out of pocket. The worst year, when I was buying my own healthcare coverage and paying out of pocket on healthcare costs, I made $39,000 that year. That's been 30 years ago. and we paid out almost $16,000 on healthcare premiums and out-of-pocket expenses. That's a whole big chunk of one's income in a single year. But on the whole, I've had a fairly charmed, blessed life. But that would not be so for everybody that you and I work with in our hospital, in our hospice, in a community group with whom we work. And where a person's experiences have come from have often had a significant bearing on how he or she views the healthcare system and their trust in it. For someone who has limited access or perceives limited access to healthcare, and that may be simply that I'm on Medicare, and when I call for a doctor's appointment with what I think might be the flu, I'm told the doctor can see me in 3.5 weeks. And it's not long before I begin to have a significant lack of trust in the system. It may be that my own prior experiences, or for that matter, the prior experience of people in my family, people I know, people who are part of our racial or ethnic group, who may be judged simply because of the color of our skin or the language or the accent with which we speak. The person who asks me where I am from, and I say I am from Mexico or Central America or the deep southern part of the United States, as if anyone could hear my accent and think otherwise. And instantly we are judged by who we are, whether we have any intelligence, whether we are in the country legally, or any number of other things. So sometimes it's prior experience. And sometimes it's just sheer fear. That's what I call perceived threat. Now, to be sure, I've even had in my family 80-plus-year-olds, octogenarians, who chose not to go to the doctor because they would rather live in the ignorant bliss of whatever this health crisis is than to find out that maybe I have cancer or maybe I have some kind of cardiac ailment. But I suspect for many people with whom we work, there is this deep and abiding fear that they will somehow be mistreated by the healthcare system. And sometimes, of course, all three of these converge at once, along with probably a whole lot of other factors that create trust. It was illustrated best to me quite a number of years ago when I was speaking to a group of social workers in Maryland, not far from Baltimore's Johns Hopkins University Hospital. And during the lunch break, one of the social workers came up to me and she said, Bill, I have a story that might just illustrate this point well. And after she told me the story, I asked her permission to use it from that point on, and I've been using it for years. She said, my mother, who I believe she told me at the time was in her mid-80s, has suffered with urinary incontinence for the better part of 15 years. She said, I've talked to my mom. She said, I've badgered her, I've cajoled her, I've tormented her in every way I know how. Mom, you don't have to suffer like this, she said. Mom, we've got doctors at Johns Hopkins that can help this. In fact, Dr. So-and-so, she's a urologist who helps women deal with this very issue, and she's worked miracles on some of my patients, and I'd love to get you an appointment. Would you let me get you an appointment? She said, finally, after I had badgered my mother for months on end about that, one afternoon, I was giving her a hard time about not going to the doctor to get this problem fixed. And she said, my mother, a little woman, 5'4", diminutive self. She didn't weigh 120 pounds, soaking wet. She pointed her little bony black finger in my face, this social work colleague said. And she said, girl, let me tell you something. Your Uncle Charlie was a Tuskegee experiment, and your fancy doctors down at Johns Hopkins are not getting their hands on me. And ladies and gentlemen, it would seem to me that that personifies the feelings that many people have in the healthcare system. One of the reasons that I, for one, have been a long and loud opponent of healthcare providers on the behavioral, psychosocial, spiritual side of the healthcare equation not wearing lab coats. I hate to see social workers and chaplains garbed in lab coats in the hospital, though I see it in teaching hospitals all over the United States where I go. One of the reasons that I hate to see that is because frequently we who are on the behavioral science side of the aisle are the only people who might be perceived to not be part of the inside scientific medical community. And I think it is essential that we be people who can be the trust builders, because we have that opportunity in front of us. Trust in the healthcare system is not something that is just granted, it's something that is earned. And it is something that can be lost very quickly by one or two events that simply make it impossible for a person to continue to trust us. So, how do we develop cultural competence? I wanted to summarize my comments today really with just these 5 basic touch points. I think, first of all, one of the things that I hope you've heard me stress is it is important that we use labels as a starting point, but not as a final word. Knowing an individual's religious perspective, his or her racial background, the nationality from which he comes, the cultural group with which he identifies, those labels provide one-word categories, and they can be wonderful to start us asking questions. You know, I know that in the past, some of my Roman Catholic patients have felt that it was really helpful if a Eucharistic minister or a member of the parish or a priest came by and brought the Eucharist, communion, or came and offered the rite of reconciliation, or joined in the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. Is that something that would be helpful for you and your family, or is that something that you wouldn't find great help in? You see, making the assumption that I know what this Catholic patient needs or wants is very different than using the prior learning that I've got as a launching pad to ask a good question. Secondly, I think it's important that we always acknowledge the broad interpretation of what I call official tenets. Now, that's a particularly religious or belief-oriented concept, but I heard this first from a priest friend of mine who once told me, Bill, what you have to always understand is that the distance from the pulpit to the pew is about 5,000 miles. And that's really true. It doesn't make any difference what a particular cultural group says is important or is always done. Often those things only act as broad parameters and not necessarily specific practices in the life of this patient, this individual, and this family. I think it's equally important that we avoid the use of insider language. It's particularly difficult for folks to use language in an attempt to connect. Sometimes we use slang terminology. It is perfectly okay for me to refer to myself as a hillbilly or a redneck. It is not okay for you to refer to me that way. Insider language is only for insiders. It can never be used by outsiders. And finally, or fourthly, I think it's important that we develop the fine art of interviewing. A wise communication professor of mine once said that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that probably gives us some idea of how we ought to be using them, that we should listen twice as much as we talk. And indeed, asking good questions that start with who, what, when, where, and how are ways to do that. Those interrogatives in, engage the person with whom I am speaking, not with a yes or no answer, or not with a question that can be answered with a yes or no answer, but rather with an opportunity to tell a story. And often what I need to do in building cultural competence is to back away from the use of labels and to embrace the hearing of stories, because it is stories that provide the nuance to how culture is particularly experienced in the life of this individual and her or his family and community of influence. And then finally, I think it is vital that you and I check our perceptions and our understandings often. Did I get that right? Does this make sense? Am I hearing this correct? What I think I heard you say was, did I get that right? Would you like me to do this? Did I hear you say you'd like me to do that? Those kinds of things say that we understand that when we are communicating cross culturally, that we are in a very real sense standing on sacred ground. Well, I've done a lot of talking, and I invite you to reach out to me in whatever way seems appropriate. My email address is there on the screen. That beautiful building in the background is the Baylor Science Building. That's the facility that I get to hang out in. It's not a bad place to have to go to work every day, to be completely honest. And if you've got a kid thinking of going to college, we'd love to talk to them. I'm especially interested in talking to them if they want to study medicine, but send them my way. And now I think we can probably take some questions, thoughts, comments, and that kind of thing. What I will say, I believe you need to email your question or send your question through the chat box, but
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoy. So yes, you can go ahead and type in any questions you have for Dr. Hoy, and we'll ask as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. Nice chunk of time to ask those questions. And thanks again for this wonderful presentation. Before we start our Q&A session, just want to take this time to thank our sponsors once more for making this presentation possible. And if you could actually go to the next slide, Bill, so we can have those up there. Perfect. Chatterton Associates, the Wealth Management Team, O'Connor Mortuary, Care Choices Hospice and Palliative Services, and Caring Companions at Home. We are so thankful for your support. I also want to do one last plug for our webinar next month, which is actually, note the date, it's going to be on a Wednesday. I know typically we have these on Tuesdays. We're going to have it on Wednesday, October 9th, and it's going to be talking about managing some changes in behaviors that we typically see in people with dementia. And so we welcome you to join us for that webinar as well. And so now we have some good questions. I want to start with so there's a couple questions that are very similar. So I'm going to kind of ask them both, and then you can kind of choose how you want to address them. And so one of them is about asking about the grieving differences between collective and individualistic cultures, and you know, kind of the nuances there. And then another one that I thought was pretty similar was asking about the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, which is familiar to most of us. And do you feel that all cultures experience these stages similarly? So I thought you could kind of address those two together.
Oh, wow. Well, so let me take the first one first. So the differences in grieving and funeral options or memorial options between collectivist and individualist societies. So I know of no collectivist society that has tried to do away with complete what we would probably call traditional funeral rituals. And when I use the term traditional funeral, what I'm really talking about here is the difference of whether we embrace having the body present and a part of the ritual or we don't. Until very recently in the United States, about 1955, almost nobody on the entire planet in history ever divorced the body, the physical remains, from the ritual surrounding that. It was seen as part of the ritual to move the body from the place of the living to the place of the dead. And traditional society rituals, collectivist society rituals, have not moved away from that in any way, shape, or form. The notion of divorcing the body from the ritual is a relatively new. It is largely, in its history, it was largely confined to white, upper middle, and upper socioeconomic status individuals. It was almost never done to save money, because those were not the people doing it. The people who were doing it were by and large the people who could afford any kind of funeral they wanted. They just chose not to do that. Nowadays, we're about, I think nationwide, around 50% of families will cremate their dead. I get various and sundry reports. I've seen reports that about half of those who cremate, so you take the 50% who bury and the half of the 50% who cremate, you've got about 75% of folks would have the body present in one way or another for the rituals. That varies somewhat according to geography and some things like that. But I don't so much see the difference in individualism and collectivism in the funeral ritual as how connected this person is to the traditional notion of keeping the body together with the ritual and then doing something, cremating it or burying it after. In terms of the Kubler-Ross stages, I'll walk gingerly on this. I hope that probably you should know if you don't, that when Kubler-Ross began, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross began in 1969 talking about stages. She was talking fundamentally about the dying process itself. It was not until much, much later, and not all of us are even convinced it was her work, that applied that to the grief process itself. But it was 30 or actually probably almost 40 years later, 35 years later, that it really got applied that way. Now, everybody and his brother applied it along the way, but Kubler-Ross did not in those early days. She was talking about terminal illness and a patient's response to that. What is important, I think, for participants in this webinar and everybody that I know to hear, is that we have never been able to find any empirical evidence that those stages actually exist. I've been taking care of the dying and bereaved for 35 years, and I've yet to see them. I see vestiges of them. I do see people who are angry. I do see people who are depressed both before and after a death. I do see people who make bargains. You know, gosh, if I could only live to June till my daughter gets married. Oh, I do see those things, but I see other manifestations of grief that are often much bigger than any of those five. For example, where does fear or guilt or loneliness fit into those five? And in my experience, those are at least as big in the cases of most bereaved people as any of those five. And I say that not to be unkind. We stand on the shoulders of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in all the work we do. But it is important to know that the bereavement caregiving community, the professional community of bereavement caregivers, has long since departed from the notion that there is any stage model of the grief process, and certainly that those five are in any way defined. So I guess the catty way for me to respond to that question is not by saying, are the stages cross-cultural, is to say the stages are really non-cultural. They don't exist in real life. They are in no way are they considered to be an accurate way to portray the grief process before the death or afterwards, either one.
Thank you for that insight. It's really helpful. Another good question. In your experience, would it be okay to offer spiritual assistance to families of different faiths? For example, to offer a Christian denomination to a Catholic priest to come and bless, etc.?
Well, I think we want to be careful of labels. So if we will be honest about it, and I'm not completely sure that I understand the context, but if, for example, I have a Protestant couple in the hospital who has just delivered a stillborn baby, and the only chaplain we have available is a Catholic priest. Is it okay for that priest to come, or we have a Muslim family? The answer to that is absolutely. In the first place, professional pastoral caregivers typically are well versed in how to sort of walk that tightrope and not in any way proselytize. It's one of the reasons healthcare chaplains are so important in the healthcare business, is because they are not beholden typically to the faith in which they practice. They're able to communicate cross-religiously or trans-religiously. But maybe the bigger question here is what's meaningful for the patient and or his or her family. And that's where I would probably just flat out ask. I think we try to make assumptions rather than just asking. And the way I would ask that would be to say to my Jewish patient or my Muslim patient, I have found that Father Tom, who is one of our chaplains, is just a phenomenal listener and caregiver, and he doesn't go wearing his Catholic faith on his sleeve. I think it might really be helpful to you if he stopped by and visited. And that doesn't mean he's going to read Catholic prayers or he's going to offer Catholic blessings if you don't want him to, but I think you'd find him to be really helpful. Would it be okay if I have him stop by? That would be much more in line, I think, with honoring the patient and the patient's family in the position where they are. And then if the patient says no, then I'm probably going to find a social work. If I think the patient is experiencing some kind of spiritual distress, then maybe what I'll do is I'll ask if they have clergy of their own community that they'd like me to get. Maybe we have a social worker who has a particular adeptness at some of those spiritual distress issues, meaning of life, and has my life counted for anything, the transcendence, those kinds of issues that are often part of the dying or grieving process. And I'm gonna lean then on one of my behavioral health colleagues who maybe isn't a religious person, a chaplain, but would maybe be able to respond in kind to some of those kinds of questions.
Great, thank you so much. We've got a lot of good questions and only a couple of minutes left, so I want to remind everyone that you will have the opportunity to, and we'll make sure and connect you with Dr. Hoy as well. But I do want to ask this one because I found it so common, especially here in our work at Alzheimer's Orange County. And so the question is, as a family caregiver for my wife who has Alzheimer's, I experienced grief on at least 3 levels. First, grieving the loss of the relationship we had in the past. Another, anticipating the eventual loss of her life, and at the same time, I grieve the loss of opportunities to experience a full life in the present. Have you observed any approaches to grief that might be useful in handling these complexities of grief? And we will end on this question, so go ahead and give it your best shot there.
Yeah, wow. Well, of course, you are doing great grief work because you've labeled those dimensions so clearly. That indicates to me a person who is doing his inner work and is fully present with it. The kinds of things that I have found helpful for folks who are anticipating a death, and as your questioner so articulately indicated, are grieving along the way. In many ways, dementia, Alzheimer's deaths, really death from any kind of debilitating illness, is the death that comes one, sort of a day at a time, and every day is a new loss or a new set of losses. And I think writing about that, journaling that can be very, very powerful. Certainly Alzheimer's Orange County has great support groups that would be helpful because the negative way to say it is misery loves company, but I think there's more to it than that. I think the positive thing that happens in support is I realize I'm not alone in this. And that's one of the most important values as we grieve. We don't grieve well when we try to grieve by ourselves. And unfortunately, families are not always all that supportive. They're constantly saying, well, Dad, you ought to place mom so that you can get some rest, and that's a lot easier said than done. So I think finding a community of support around us who will certainly point out when there are things that I'm doing that are unhealthy, but will also let me be me and will let me grieve at the pace that I'm grieving. But I very much applaud this participant's ability to articulate that, and I would say stay in that idea. I'd write down every day, what are the things that I've already lost? What are the things I feel like I'm losing now in my current life and business? They call it opportunity cost. Because we are walking through this stage means we are not able to travel. We are not able to do these other things. And that's a real loss. Write that down, put it down in black and white. And then what do I anticipate it will be like when she dies, because that day is coming and I don't know when, but it is coming. And to write about that, to think about it in those categories can be very powerful.
Thank you so much. Definitely no easy answers, but that's a good reminder for all of us. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Hoy,
Thank
for
you
this
for letting me be
presentation.
part of that.
Yeah, of course. And so I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar, and do watch out for that survey that's going to pop up. It'll also be emailed to you in an hour. So go ahead and fill that out, especially if you need CE credit, and watch out for our next webinar as well. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next time.